Imagine for a moment that the flick of a switch is not just a forgotten luxury, but a concept that simply does not exist. It is ain't 8 in 5 in rural America. The sun has dipped below the horizon, and with it, the modern world, as you know it, has effectively ceased to function. There is no hum of a refrigerator, no glow from a smartphone, and no steady street lamp to guide your way. There is only the encroaching, absolute weight of darkness. For those living in the early 19th century, the sunset was not merely a transition to evening, it was an absolute boundary. It dictated the economy of movement, the rhythm of labour, and the geography of the human mind. When night fell, the world shrank to the flickering circumference of a tallow candle or the dying embers of a hearth fire. We often romanticize the simpler times of the past, imagining a peaceful life removed from the frantic pace of industrial society. But strip away the electricity that powers our digital lives, and you find a reality defined by profound endurance. You find a world where the preservation of a single flame was a matter of survival, where the darkness was a tangible living presence, and where every mundane task, from fetching water to mending a garment, required a level of physical labour that would leave the modern person breathless within hours. Today, we are embarking on a journey to the heart of the 800s. We are not just looking at a historical period, we are reconstructing a human experience. We will explore how the pioneers, the farmers, and the townsfolk of this era navigated the fundamental challenges of life without the invisible infrastructure we take for granted. This is the story of how America truly lived before the light was harnessed, and how the absence of power forced humanity to invent its own ways to endure, thrive, and define its destiny. The channel Sleepy History with Kevin is a storytime platform created for entertainment, inspiration, education, and the promotion of positive emotional values. When the sun vanished, the home transformed. Inside a typical 800 farmhouse, the darkness was not empty. It was filled with the scents of wood smoke, curing meats, and the sharp, slightly acrid tang of tallow candles. Lighting a home was not a passive act of flicking a switch. It was an active, labour-intensive chore that occupied the better part of a household's preparation time. Candles were the primary source of illumination, but they were far from the clean, burning, scented waxes we know today. Most families relied on tallow-rendered animal fat, usually from cows or sheep. The process of making them was a seasonal ritual, often performed in late autumn. It required massive pots, a constant fire, and a painstaking repetitive dipping process. A family could spend days standing over hot vats, dipping wicks into molten fat, allowing them to cool, and repeating the process dozens of times until each candle reached the desired thickness. These candles were precious. They guttered in the breeze, smoked heavily, and emitted a faint, earthy smell that lingered in the heavy fabric of wool clothing. Because light was so labour-intensive to produce, it was used with extreme frugality. In the early 19th century, after dark, the family did not scatter to different rooms with personal lights. They gathered. The hearth was the gravitational centre of the home, not just for heat, but for illumination. To see the page of a book, to mend a shirt, or to carve a wooden tool, one had to sit within a few feet of the fire or a singular precious candle placed on a central table. This limitation forced a specific quiet intimacy upon the family. In the flickering glow, generations shared stories, gossip, and the day's trials. The environment was not conducive to individual pursuits. It demanded collective action. It was a time when the oral tradition thrived, not necessarily because people had nothing better to do, but because the darkness made it impossible to do anything else. Yet this darkness also hid secrets. It obscured the dust, the wear on the floorboards, and the inevitable decay of a home that was never truly clean by modern standards. In the 800s, you didn't judge a neighbour's house by the bright, harsh glare of an overhead lamp. You judged it by the warmth of the fire they kept and the steady flickering glow that signalled their survival through the long, cold night. If light was the battle for comfort, then food was the battle for survival. In the 800s, the concept of fresh was entirely seasonal. When you walked into a kitchen in early 19th century America, you were entering a space governed by the relentless decay of organic matter. Without the miracle of the mechanical refrigerator, the American home had to become a sophisticated laboratory of food preservation. During the harvest months, life was a blur of frantic productivity. Every vegetable, fruit and cut of meat had to be processed before the rot set in. Women spent weeks in the heat of the kitchen, their faces flushed from the fire, turning cucumbers into pickles, fruit into preserves, and cabbage into sauerkraut. This was not a hobby. It was insurance policy against the starvation that inevitably knocked on the door when the snows arrived. Meat was the greatest challenge. To keep a hog through the winter, it had to be butchered in late fall, when the ambient temperature was finally low enough to stave off rapid spoilage. It was a visceral, bloody process that involved the entire community. The meat was either salted in heavy wooden barrels, packed tight with coarse salt, or hung in a smokehouse, where the constant acrid drift of hickory smoke created a chemical barrier against bacteria. This lifestyle dictated a specific kind of American palate. Food was salty, dry, and intense. Fresh milk was a luxury that lasted only as long as the cow was productive and the weather was cool. Butter had to be salted and stored in crocks, often buried in the cellar to keep it from turning rancid. The cellar, in fact, was the heart of the home's survival. It was a dark, cool earthen, floored sanctuary where the smell of damp soil mingled with the sharp tang of vinegar and the sweetness of stored apples. To live in the 800s was to be intimately acquainted with the lifecycle of food. You knew exactly which animal provided the meal, which tree the fruit fell from, and how many hours of labour were required to make that food edible in the middle of February. There was no convenience. There was only the cycle of the seasons, the harsh reality of the harvest, and the constant quiet labour of ensuring that the larder remained full enough to see the family through to the spring. To understand the 800s, one must understand the sheer, unrelenting physicality of existence. In the modern era, we often mistake work for the hours we spend at a desk. But in the 19th century, work was a full-body exertion that began before the sun crested the horizon and ended only when the light failed entirely. Every domestic task was a test of endurance. Consider the simple act of laundry. Today is a matter of pressing a button and letting a machine manage the cycles. 2 centuries ago, it was a multi-day operation that could physically incapacitate a person. It began with hauling water from a well or a creek, bucket by heavy bucket. Then the water had to be heated over an open flame. Clothes were scrubbed by hand against washboards until knuckles were raw, boiled in lye. Soap that could burn the skin, rinsed in cold water, and finally wrung out with intense manual effort. This was back-breaking labour that left the hands chapped and the back aching for days. The same intensity applied to every facet of life. Floors were scrubbed with sand and lye, their very surfaces worn down by generations of intense cleaning. Wood for the stove had to be chopped, split and stacked. The garden required constant weeding and weighing, or the household would go hungry come winter. There was no leisure time in the contemporary sense. There was only the transition from one arduous task to the next. This constant motion was the glue of the community. People survived because they were integrated into a web of mutual reliance, where the health of the family depended on the efficiency of its individual members. It was a life lived in the present tense, where the future was rarely considered beyond the next harvest or the next cold snap. The pride of the 19th century American was not found in possessions, but in the capability of one's own body to stain the household against the indifferent, and often brutal, forces of nature. All stories on this channel, Sleepy History with Kevin, are fictional, thoughtfully crafted around historical themes and inspired by real events, figures and periods, reimagined for engaging storytelling. The content does not represent real individuals, actual events or documented cases. Any resemblance to real people, animals or events is purely coincidental. In a world where communication was limited to the speed of a horse or the cadence of a voice, isolation was a constant looming threat. Yet the American landscape of the 1800s was not a collection of lonely, disconnected dots. It was a tapestry held together by the thread of human interaction. When night fell and the hearth fire became the only sanctuary against the vast, inhospitable darkness of the wilderness, the need for human connection became an existential necessity. Communities were forged in the crucible of shared labour, the barn raisings, the husking bees, and the quilting circles. These were not merely social events, they were the essential mechanisms through which survival was distributed. If a neighbour's barn burned or a family fell ill during the harvest, the community responded not out of charity, but out of a recognised, shared vulnerability. You helped your neighbour because, in a world without safety nets, you were the safety net. On the long winter nights, when the work slowed but did not stop, the oral history of the region was written and written. Tales were told, some true, some exaggerated, some pure folklore about the spirits of the woods, the history of the families that had come before, and the rumours of the changing politics in the distant cities. In the flickering firelight, these stories took on a life of their own. They served as a bridge between the physical reality of hard labour and the imaginative landscape of the mind. If you are finding this exploration in the raw, unvarnished history of the 19th century as fascinating as I am, please consider subscribing to the channel. By joining our community, you support the effort to bring these untold stories of human resilience back into the light. Hit that like button and subscribe to stay updated as we continue to peel back the layers of how life was true lived, one chapter at a time. Your support is what allows us to keep digging into the archives and bring these lost voices back to life. These nights were long, but they were not lonely. They were the crucible of the American character, a period where people learned that, while the individual might be fragile, against the forces of nature, the collective, bound by tradition and mutual reliance, was a force that could tame a continent. The 19th century American home was not a fortress against nature. It was a participant in it. Whether it was a log cabin on the edge of the frontier or a clapboard farmhouse in the settled East, the boundary between inside and outside was often remarkably porous. Construction was dictated by the landscape, massive timber hewn by hand, stones cleared from fields to build the foundations, and chinking made of clay or lime to seal the gaps between the logs. When winter arrived, the home became a study in contrasts. Near the hearth, the air could be stifling, the heat intense enough to burn the skin of a child playing too close. Yet just a few feet away, in the corners of the room or near the window casings, the frost would creep in, tracing intricate crystalline patterns on the interior wood. In the deepest months of the year, water left in a pail overnight would often be covered by a thin skin of ice by morning. Families learned to live within these thermal zones. During the day, activity was centered around the kitchen and the hearth. At night, the bedrooms, tucked into the rafters or under the eaves, were frigid. The remedy was not a thermostat, but layers. Heavy wool blankets, often woven by the household's own hands, were weighted down with thick quilts. These were not just bedding. They were communal projects, often passed down through generations, each stitch a record of the family's history and their struggle to keep the cold at bay. There was a profound psychological weight to the silence of a house in winter. When the wind howled outside, whistling through the cracks in the eaves, it was a constant reminder of the world's indifference. You could hear the settling of the timbers, the groaning of the chimney, and the movement of the forest just beyond the walls. It was a life lived in constant dialogue with the elements. You did not ignore the weather, you monitored it with the intensity of a soldier. You learned to read the clouds, the behavior of the birds, and the subtle change in the air pressure for your comfort, and often your very survival, depended on the accuracy of your forecast. In the 800s, the distance between health and sickness was often measured not in miles, but in the contents of one's own pantry and knowledge of the wild. With professional medical care being a rare luxury, often days away by wagon, every household was forced to act as its own apothecary. The line between a cook and a healer was non-existent. The same hands that stirred the stew pot were expected to know exactly which dried herb could quell a fever or soothe a laceration. Gardens were meticulously planned, but for pharmacology, mint, sage, yarrow, and elderberry were not merely seasonings, they were the first line of defense. Every mother and grandma held a mental archive of recipes passed down through generations, poultices of mustard to draw out the congestion from a winter cold, infusions of willow bark to dull the sharp ache of rheumatism, and pungent tinctures meant to purify the blood. It was a practice rooted in deep observation, a belief that the earth, if asked correctly, would provide the remedy for the ailments it inflicted. However, this reliance on folk wisdom carried a heavy weight of uncertainty. When a contagion swept through a settlement, or a deep wound became infected, the limits of these remedies were painfully apparent. There was a constant, underlying anxiety, a quiet dread of the invisible dangers that lurked in the water, the air, and the very ground beneath their feet. It was a time when the boundaries of life and death felt closer, more tangible. The struggle for health was a physical negotiation. If a fever took hold, the entire household's rhythm was disrupted. Someone had to tend to the fire, someone had to monitor the patient, and someone else had to manage the chores that could never be set aside. This shared responsibility for survival created a unique social fabric. It fostered a resilience that is hard to grasp today, a stoic acceptance that while the body was frail, the community's collective effort was a form of protection. You did not just survive as an individual. You survived because you were part of a lineage that had learned, through generations of trial and error, how to endure the persistent, silent threats of a world without modern medicine. When the sun vanished and the flickering glow of the hearth became the only illumination, the 19th century American home transformed into theatre of the mind. In an age where mass-produced books were a rare commodity and formal education was a privilege often sacrificed too. The demands of the harvest, the primary repository of knowledge, was not the printed page, it was the human memory. These long dark evenings were the true classrooms of the era, As the embers popped and shifted, the elders became the conduits of history. They spoke not from textbooks, but from the raw lived experience of their ancestors. They told of the arduous journeys across the Appalachian ranges, the grit required to clear a stubborn forest, and the subtle shifts in the landscape that mark the changing seasons. For a child growing up in the 1800s, the world was built upon these narratives. They learned the history of their own lineage and the geography of their survival through the cadence of a voice in the dark. This oral transmission was vital for the preservation of culture. Without television or radio, the imagination was the ultimate entertainment medium. Children were trained to listen, to observe, and to retain information with a precision that modern society, with its constant influx of digital data, has largely lost. They were taught the why and how of every action, why we harvest at a specific lunar phase, how we track the migration of the game, and the importance of holding on to community secret. These stories were often layered with moral lessons, weaving tales of hardship and triumph in the fabric of the household's identity. It is here, in the quiet, shadowed corners of history, that we find the true essence of human resilience. If you are captivated by these intimate portraits of our ancestors' struggles and the ingenuity they employed to thrive in the dark, then you are part of the journey. Please show your support by hitting that like button, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. Your subscriptions are the fuel that powers our research, allowing us to reconstruct these forgot chapters of American life with the depth and care they deserve. By growing this community, you ensure that these voices, once dimmed by the passage of time, continue to resonate in our modern world. As the story continued, the lines between fact and myth blurred. A grandmother's account of a bear encounter or a grandmother's recollection of a harsh, frost-bitten winter were not just stories, they were essential data points for survival. They taught the next generation how to navigate a world that was unforgiving, yet strangely beautiful in its raw, unfilled state. In these moments, huddled together against the encroaching cold, the family was not just surviving. They were building a culture, one story at a time, ensuring that the legacy of their struggle would not vanish with the extinguishing of the last candle. In the 1800s, geography was not merely a backdrop for life. It was a formidable adversary that dictated the very limits of human ambition. For a family living on a farmstead, tucked away in the rolling hills of the frontier, the world beyond their property line was a vast, unpredictable wilderness. There were no highways, no paved shoulders, and certainly no bridges that could withstand the fury of a spring thaw. The concept of a journey was entirely redefined by the physical reality of dirt, mud, and endless miles of forest. To travel even 10 miles was a strategic endeavour that required planning, preparation, and an acceptance of risk. The roads, if they could be called that, were often little more than rutted wagon paths that turned into impassable quagmires after a heavy rain. A loaded wagon could easily snap an axle in a deep hidden hole, leaving a family stranded for hours or even days, miles from the nearest neighbour. Consequently, most people lived within a very tight radius. Their world was defined by the distance one could travel, conduct business, and return from within the span of a single daylight-filled day. This isolation was the defining characteristic of rural American life. Because of it, every item that could not be produced on the farm, iron tools, fine fabrics, salt or medicine, became an incredibly precious commodity. Commerce was conducted in a slow, deliberate rhythm, often dictated by the seasons. In the autumn after the harvest, farmers would hitch their teams to heavy wagons, laden with surplus grain or livestock, and begin the arduous trek to the nearest town or river port. These were not just trade trips. They were the lifeline that allowed the family to participate in the broader economy of the nation. Yet this isolation also fostered a remarkable degree of local self-sufficiency, because you could not simply run to a store when something broke or ran out. You were forced to become a master of improvisation. You learned to forge metal in your own small shop, to weave cloth from the wool of your own sheep, and to tan leather from the hides of your own cattle. The household was a self-contained economic unit operating on a philosophy of make dough, use it up, wear it out, or dough without. It was a life of quiet tension, where the sounds of an approaching wagon or a rider on horseback were significant events, signalling the arrival of news from the outside world. People would gather, their curiosity piqued, to hear the latest tidings, a change in political leadership, the rumour of a new mill opening, or the report of the state of the crops in the next county. In this era, information travelled at the speed of a trotting horse, and the arrival of a traveller was often the only way a family felt connected to the shifting tides of the nation. They lived in their own secluded pockets, anchored by their hearths and their fields, forever mindful that the wilderness was not merely a place they inhabited, but a vast silent presence that surrounded them on every side, waiting for the slightest mistake to reclaim its own. While the 6 days of the week were dominated by the physical struggle for survival, the endless cycle of clearing land, tending livestock and mending tools, the seventh day, Sunday, was a structural necessity for the American soul. In the 1800s, the Sabbath was more than just a religious observance. It was the essential pause that prevented the crushing weight of manual labour from eroding the human spirit. It was the only day when the rhythm of the world slowed down, allowing for a collective reflection that went beyond the immediate demands of the next meal. The church, often modest wooden-framed structure, built with the collective effort of the settlement, served as the bedrock of the community. It was the only place where families from miles around would converge. The journey to service, often made in the crisp air of early morning, was a pilgrimage of sorts. As the wagons rattled down the trails and the sounds of horses echoed through the woods, a sense of belonging began to take shape. For those who spent their weeks in profound isolation, the sight of a neighbour's carriage or the distant sound of a bell ringing in the clearing was a powerful, emotional anchor. The inside the church was thick with a mix of wood smoke, damp wool, and a shared, earnest reverence. The sermon was often the primary source of intellectual stimulation, a bridge between the grueling reality of daily labour and the higher questions of existence. It provided a framework for understanding suffering, for celebrating small victories, and for navigating the complex ethics of a community that had to rely on one another to survive. It was here that news was exchanged, marriages were arranged, and disputes were settled. The church wasn't just a place of faith, it was the information hub of the frontier. If you are finding this journey through the fabric of the 19th century American life to be both thought-provoking and deeply moving, please ensure you are subscribed to the channel. Your active participation, liking, commenting and sharing these stories helps us continue to reconstruct these intricate historical landscapes with the care and depth they demand. Every subscription acts as a beacon, drawing more listens to these forgotten narratives of human endurance. We invite you to be a part of our ongoing mission to document the reality of a world that existed long before our modern conveniences took hold. The sanctity of the day also provided a vital psychological reset. After a week of wrestling with the elements, of seeing the raw, unrefined side of nature, there was a profound comfort in the order of the service. It was a reminder that even in a world that felt indifferent to human effort, there was purpose, tradition, and a shared set of values that connected one family to the next. As the service concluded, and the families dispersed back to their separate corners of the forest, they carried with them a renewed sense of resilience, having been reminded that they were not alone in their struggle. The harsh, quiet darkness of the week ahead seemed just a little more manageable, framed by the memory of that brief, sacred pause where the community stood as one against the vastness of the American wilderness. When the brutal grip of winter truly tightened, the house became a cocoon. The world outside was a silent, frozen landscape of white, inaccessible and unforgiving. Inside, however, the hearth was the beating heart of the family, and it was here that the true character of the 19th century American home revealed itself. With the fields dormant and the outside chores restricted to absolute essentials, the long, dark hours of the evening were filled with a specific kind of industrious creativity. It was during these stretches of time that the true ingenuity of the pioneer flourished. A piece of scrap wood was not just firewood. In the hands of a father, it became a carved horse for his daughter, or a spinning top for his son. A bundle of leftover wool was not just insulation. It was transformed through nimble fingers into warm mittens or socks. Each stitch a testament to the family's desire to care for one another, despite the scarcity of resources. These were not mere pastimes. They were acts of defiance against the harsh, indifferent reality of their environment. By crafting objects of beauty or utility, they exerted control over their small enclosed world. In the soft, golden light of the fire, the sounds of the home were distinct, the rhythmic click of knitting needles, the gentle rasp of a whittling knife against cedar, and the low, steady hum of conversation. The air would be filled with the scent of drying herbs, the sharp, clean aroma of wood shavings, and the comforting, earthy smell of baked bread. In these moments, the physical struggle of the day was set aside. The family was engaged in a collective endeavour to maintain warmth, both literal and emotional. There was a quiet, profound dignity in this labour, the realization that despite the howling winds outside, and the primitive nature of their surroundings, they were building a life that was rich in meaning. They taught each other skills that were essential for survival, yet practiced them with an artistry that defied the bleakness of their circumstances. A mother might teach her child the intricate patterns of a quilt, explain how each scrap of fabric held a memory of a past garment or a distant relative. A father might show his son how to balance the weight of a tool for maximum efficiency, a lesson in physics masked as a simple task. This was the true education of the 800s, a transfer of wisdom from one generation to the next, fueled by the necessity of survival, but refined by the human instinct to create. It was a slow, deliberate existence. You could not rush the cooling of an oven, the drying of timber, or the mending of a winter cloak. You had to learn the pace of the materials themselves. This patience was the bedrock of the pioneer identity. They lived in harmony with the limitations of their era, finding a peculiar, deep-seated satisfaction in the labour of their own hands. Even when the darkness seemed overwhelming, the light of the hearth was enough to bridge the gap between their reality and the life they were determined to build. This content is inspired by and adapted from public domain works available through Project Gutenberg. The material has been transformed through original narration, editing, and storytelling to create a unique experience for educational and entertainment purposes. In the landscape of 800s America, A home was rarely a private domain for just a nuclear couple and their offspring. It was a sprawling, multi-generational vessel of survival. The presence of grandparents, aunts, and uncles under a single roof was not an anomaly. It was the standard arrangement for a life that required a constant, coordinated effort. This structure created a unique social ecosystem where the wisdom of the age was woven into the daily survival of the young. The elder were the living libraries of the settlement. In a world where written records were often lost or never existed, the stories held within the memories of the eldest family members were the primary map for navigating the challenges of the land. When a particularly harsh spring threatened the planting schedule, or when a mysterious ailment began to affect the livestock, it was the grandfather's memory of a similar crisis 40 years prior that provided the guidance needed to survive. They held the knowledge of the old ways, the subtle weather patterns, the specific medicinal properties of local roots, and the intricate manual skills that could spell the difference between abundance and want. For the children growing up in these homes, the presence of their elders provide a sense of continuity that is rare in our modern transient society. They saw their grandparents not as separate, removed figures, but as active participants in the struggle. They watched as gnarled, weathered hands continued to mend fishing nets or shell corn long after their physical strength had begun to fade. This taught the younger generation a profound, silent lesson, that a person's value was not measured by their peak physical capacity, but by their endurance, their contributions to the family's well-being, and the legacy of knowledge they passed down. The household became a living classroom. Every evening was an opportunity for the transmission of culture. Whether it was the rhythmic storytelling by the hearth or the meticulous instruction in basic craftsmanship, the young were constantly being prepared to shoulder the burdens that their elders had carried for decades. It was a cycle of responsibility. The young provided the physical labor needed for the heavy tasks, while the old provided the strategy and the moral framework that kept the family together. There was a quiet, profound respect that permeated these interactions. It was not a formal, stiff arrangement, but a function necessity that bred deep emotional bonds. In the isolation of the frontier, family was the only true defense against the overwhelming forces of nature. The elder knew that their survival depended on the care of their children, and the young knew that their success depended on the guidance of their elders. This symbiotic relationship formed the backbone of the American family unit during the 19th century. It created a sense of stability that allowed them to endure the long, dark winters and the unpredictable trials of the seasons. They were not just a group of individuals living under one roof. They were a singular entity, anchored by the past and committed to the future, weathering the storms of existence together. As the 1800s progressed toward their final decades, the relentless cycle of manual labor began to encounter its first significant disruptions. It was not a sudden, violent break from the past, but a slow, creeping encroachment of progress that whispered through the valley. It started with subtle shifts in the home, the replacement of smoky, laborious tallow candles with the cleaner, brighter flicker of kerosene lamps. Suddenly, the evening was no longer just a time to huddle in the hearth's dim light. It was a time that could be reclaimed, extended, and used for more nuanced pursuits. The arrival of mass-produced goods, delivered by the expanding web of railroads and peddler wagons, fundamentally altered the economics of the household. A farmer no longer had to spend his entire winter crafting a simple iron rake if he could trade a portion of his crop for one forged in a distant, roaring factory. These manufactured tools were not always better, but they were consistent, a novelty that the pioneer found both fascinating and slightly disconcerting. It meant that the self-sufficient ideal was beginning to fray at the edges, replaced by a new emerging dependency on a world that existed far beyond the horizon. This transition brought with it a shift in the human perception of time. In the early part of the century, time was fluid, dictated by the sun, the seasons, and the physical capacity of the body. But as newspapers became more accessible, bringing with them a sense of national events, and as watches began to appear in the pockets of the more prosperous townsfolk, time became standardized. It became a measurement of efficiency. The long, unstructured evenings that once served the primary venue for storytelling and community cohesion began to compete with the new demand for productivity and the lure of outside information. For the older generation, this was a period of quiet unease. They watched as their children, fascinated by the promise of these new conveniences, began to look past the boundaries of the farm and toward the beckoning lights of growing cities. The craft of the hand, the patience of the harvest, and the deep-rooted connection to the land, these were the pillars of their existence. And they feared that as the darkness was pushed back by progress, something essential about the human spirit would be lost in the process. Yet there was an undeniable allure to this transformation. The same spirit that had driven the ancestors to cross the mountains and tame the wilderness was now being channeled into curiosity about this new, evolving world. The 800s were ending, but the story of the American struggle was merely shifting its focus. The battle against the elements remained, but it was now supplemented by the challenge of adapting to a reality where the impossible, the steady, reliable light, the distance covered in hours rather than days, was become the new baseline of life. It was a time of transition, a lingering twilight between the world of the hearth and the world of the engine. As the century drew to a close, those who had weathered the storms of the 800s understood that they had participated in something far larger than their own individual lives. They were not merely farmers or homesteaders, they were the architects of a legacy. The land they had cleared, the timber they had hewn, and the communities they had forged were the physical foundations of a nation that was rapidly evolving. But beyond the stone walls and the cleared fields, they had passed down something even more enduring, a philosophy of existence forged in the crucible of absolute necessity. They taught their children that true security did not come from the availability of tools or the ease of life, but from the internal capacity to adapt, to endure, and to find value in the most modest of circumstances. They passed down the oral histories of their struggles, not as complaints, but as proof of their triumph. Every story told beside the dying embers of the hearth was an investment in the next generation's character. By remembering the hardness of the earth and the length of the winter nights, they ensured that their children would never be softened by the comforts of the future. This transition was carried by a quiet, profound pride. Looking out over a landscape that had been transformed by decades of human exertion, they saw the reflection of their own tenacity. The small isolated farms that were once tenuous outposts were now the centres of functioning, connected communities. The knowledge that had been gained through trial and error, the understanding of the soil, the seasons, and the delicate balance of the wilderness had become a cultural heritage. It was an intangible wealth that defined the American spirit of that time, a blend of rugged individualism and deeply ingrained communal reliance. They understood that the world was changing. They saw the encroaching signs of the new industrial age. the telegraph lines stretching like spiders' webs across the horizon, the rumble of locomotives in the distance, and the changing demands of a society that was beginning to move at a pace they could barely comprehend. Yet they did not fear the future. They had mastered the hardest teacher of all nature itself, and they knew that no matter how much the world changed, the fundamental human need for purpose, for connection, and for resilience would remain the same. In those final years of the century, there was a sense of completion. The fires that had illuminated their dark nights were now becoming a symbol of a bygone era, a memory to be cherished rather than a daily necessity to be managed. But the lesson learned in that light, the lessons of patience, of craftsmanship, and of the profound intimacy of the family unit, were woven into the very fabric of the society that was to come. They were the ancestors who had held the line, who had thrived in the dark so that the next generation could walk in the light with a firm foundation beneath their feet. They left behind a world that was no longer a mystery to be feared, but a home to be built upon, shaped by the memory of the hands that had worked the soil. As we stand at the threshold of the closing chapters of this era, it becomes clear that the 800s were not merely a period of isolation and struggle. They were a grand laboratory of the human spirit. The transformation from a life governed by the rising and setting of the sun to a world on the precipice of industrial mastery was not just a change in technology. It was a fundamental shift in the human consciousness. We have explored the hearth, the harvest, the darkness, and the community, but in doing so, we have only scratched the surface of the forces that were quietly, relentlessly building the foundation of the world we inhabit today. The pioneers who navigated the deep forests and cleared the rocky soils did not know, nor could they have fully comprehended, the immense speed at which their descendants would eventually live. They built their homes with the wood of the land, and their lives with the strength of their convictions. Often look at the horizon with a mix of trepidation and hope. That horizon, once a physical barrier of distance and unknown danger, began to shrink as the century turned. The rails were laid, the telegraph wires hummed with the first sparks of a connected world, and the isolated pockets of humanity began to blur into singular national narrative. Yet as we look back from our vantage point in the modern age, we are left to wonder, what exactly did we lose in that rapid pursuit of progress? When we traded the dim, warm intimacy of the tallow candle for the harsh, constant brilliance of electricity, we gained convenience, yes, but we also lost a specific rhythmic cadence of life that forced us to be present in our own survival. We lost the necessity of silence, the luxury of unhurried thought, and the profound physical connection to the environment that defined every waking moment of our ancestors. Is the modern world truly better, or is it simply faster? As the shadows of the 19th century recede further into the past, the questions they raise become more poignant. We see the echoes of their struggle in our own desire for stability, our search for meaning in a world that feels increasingly fragmented, and our longing for the kind of deep communal bonds that were once forged in the crucible of the frontier. The history of this era is not a static object on a shelf. It is a living, breathing lineage that pulses beneath the surface of our current lives. The story of how people really lived, the mechanics of their endurance, the architecture of their families, and the silent, resilient growth of their culture is far from over. It is a narrative that continues to evolve, constantly reminding us that the foundations upon which we stand were laid by hands that are now long gone, but whose spirit remains as constant as the rising sun. As we look forward, the transition into the new century looms ahead, promising even greater upheaval, and even more remarkable human stories. We have arrived at the edge of one world, looking out toward the dawn of another, and the journey, in all its complexity and wonder, is only just beginning. As the 8800s finally retreated in the page of history, the air itself seemed to change. The silence that had once defined the American landscape, a silence broken only by the wind in the trees, or the distant call of a wild creature, was increasingly interrupted by a new rhythmic mechanical hum. It was the sound of the steam engine, the mechanical loom, and the printing press. It was the sound of a nation that had decided, collectively and irrevocably, that the future lay in the velocity of production. For the generation that had spent their entire life mastering the subtle, quiet arts of survival, this shift was both awe-inspiring and deeply alienating. They watched as their children, who had been raised on the stories of the frontier, began to look at the family farm not as an inheritance to be cherished, but as a place of stagnant labour. The city, with its electric streetlights, its teeming markets, and its promise of wages that could be counted in, coin rather than measured in bushels of wheat, began to exert a gravitation pull that no hearth fire could counter. The social fabric that had been woven so tightly by the need for communal reliance began to stretch. When you can buy a shirt from a catalogue or a tool from a merchant, the need to sit with your neighbour and mend your own becomes a choice rather than a necessity. This shift in dependency was the true revolution. It wasn't just about the technology, it was about the structuring of the human soul. We began to specialise. We began to move away from the holistic, total, life approach of the pioneer and toward the compartmentalised, efficient life of the modern citizen. But as families packed their belonging into trunks and head toward the railway stations, they carried with them the ghosts of the previous century. They carried the memory of what it meant to rely on one's own hands, the ingrained patience of waiting for the seasons, and the profound unspoken knowledge that nature is a force that can never truly be conquered, only navigated. They were stepping into a world of instant results, yet they carried the internal rhythm of a world that understood the value of slow growth. This tension between the old ways and the new reality defined the threshold of the 20th century. It was a time of immense optimism, fueled by the belief that humanity had finally shackled the forces of nature, but it was also a time of quiet, existential dread. What happened to a community when the shared labour that held it together is replaced by the efficiency of a machine? What happens to a person when they no longer need the skills their grandparents deemed essential for survival? The questions were just beginning to surface, swirling in the smoke of the rising industrial centres, waiting for the coming decades to provide their answers. We were leaving the era of the pioneer, but we were carrying their spirit with us, uncertain of how it would fare in the glare of the new world. If the farmhouse was the body of pioneer family, the kitchen was undeniably its heart. For generations, this space had been defined by the overwhelmed presence of the open hearth, a massive soot-stained fireplace that demanded constant attention and physical sacrifice. But as the 20th century dawned, the hearth began to lose its status as the sole master of the house. In its place, the heavy cast iron wood burning stove began to take center stage, bringing with it a subtle but profound shift in the domestic order. The introduction of the stove was a liberation of sorts. No longer did a woman have to hunch over an open flame, risking her skirts to the embers, to manage the temperature of her cooking. The stove provided control, a series of iron plates that could be moved, a chimney that could be damped, and a regulated heat that allowed for a level of culinary consistency that had been, until then, a luxury of the wealthy. With this control came a new expectation. The kitchen was no longer just a site of survival, it was becoming a site of management. We see this change in the tools that began to appear on the wooden prep tables. Hand-cranked apple peelers, mechanical meat grinders, and metal whisks started to replace the heavy hand, carved wooden implements of the past. These tools were marvels of the new industrial age, promising to save time and effort, yet they brought with them a new kind of rhythm. The kitchen was becoming more efficient, yes, but it was also becoming less intimate. The process of preparing a meal was shifting from a rhythmic, meditative labour of the hands to a more mechanical, output-driven task. This period was carried by a distinct, you would often find a home where the old hand-hewn wooden bowls sat right next to a gleaming factory-made steel sieve. It was a visual representation of a family caught in the middle of a transition. The mothers and grandmothers of this era stood in these kitchens, manoeuvring between the skills they had inherited from their ancestors and the promises of the new products arriving by mail order. There was a lingering nostalgia for the old way of doing things, mixed with the undeniable relief that the physical toll of domestic labour was, finally, beginning to lighten. Yet this shift also began to change the way the family interacted. The kitchen table, once the absolute centre of gravity where everyone huddled to keep warm, began to feel slight more spacious as the stove provided its own, more efficient heat. The air was cleaner, the smoke was contained, and the frantic, constant battle against the soot began to wane. But as the physical difficulty of the work diminished, a new, quieter pressure emerged, the pressure of domestic science. Advice manuals began to circulate teaching the proper way to scrub a floor, the scientific way to preserve a harvest, and the modern way to run a home. The hearth had been a source of warmth, the stove was becoming a source of standards. We were moving away from the survival of the family and toward the cultivation of the household, and in that transition, the very spirit of what it meant to keep house was forever altered. If the kitchen was the heart of the home, the clothing worn by its inhabitant was the outer skin of their identity. Throughout the 800s, this skin was largely domestic. The fabric was the result of a grueling, months-long process, the shearing of sheep, the carding of wool, the spinning of yarn, and finally the rhythmic hypnotic clack of the loom that echoed through the home on long winter evenings. Clothing was a testament to the labour of the family. A coat was not just a garment. It was a record of the wool that had been harvested, cleaned and dyed with local roots and berries. It was a tangible piece of the family's survival, built to last a lifetime and patched repeatedly until the original cloth was all but forgotten. But as the calendar turned toward the 20th century, the sight of a woman hunched over a loom became increasingly rare. In its place, the catalogue in the general store offered a new, intoxicating possibility: the ready-made. For the first time, families could look through a paper booklet, select a pattern or a pre-stitched garment, and have it delivered by rail or wagon. This was more than a convenience, it was a psychological shift. It signalled that the family's identity was no longer solely defined by what they could produce with their own hands, but by what they could acquire from the broader world. The transition was not immediate, nor was it always welcomed. There was a lingering pride in the homespun garment. It spoke of self-reliance, of a household that needed nothing from the outside world to clothe itself. To wear a dress bought from a store in the distant county seat was to signal a subtle, perhaps even threatening, change in status. It suggested that the family had surplus grain, surplus livestock, or surplus time that could be traded for the labour of someone else. This change also altered the way people moved through the world. The fabrics of the new era, lighter cottons, manufactured blends, and the first hints of synthetic jays were softer, more colourful and less utilitarian than the heavy, scratchy wools of the pioneer past. People began to dress not just for the weather, but for the occasion. The Sunday best, which had once been a single carefree preserved outfit, began to encompass a wider variety of styles. The distinction between work clothes and leisure clothes became sharper, mirroring the growing separation between the hours spent in labour and the hours reclaimed for oneself. Yet this shift brought an underlying anxiety. When you no longer know the hand that wove the cloth or the source of the thread, you lose a connection to the material world around you. You become a consumer rather than a creator. In the small communities that had been so tightly bound by the shared necessity of production, the arrival of store, bought goods created a new, invisible hierarchy. It introduced the concept of fashion, a fleeting, intangible measure of worth that had little to do with the harsh realities of farm life. As families stepped in these new fabrics, they were stepping into a different social reality, one where the measure of a person was no longer just their resilience against the winter, but their ability to participate in the growing, complex, and often anonymous economy of the new century. The threads of the past were being unravelled, and in their place, a new, more intricate, and far more demanding tapestry was being woven. For the better part of the 19th century, the boundaries of a family's world were defined by the horizon they could see and the stories they could hear. Knowledge was a communal or a tradition. It was heavy, shaped by the weight of experience, and transmitted only when one person spoke and another listened. But as the new century approached, a quiet intellectual revolution began to unfold, carried on the back of the printed page. The arrival of the local newspaper, often arriving by mail days or weeks after it was printed, acted as a portal to a reality that existed far beyond the farmstead. The simple act of literacy, once a luxury of the elite or a practical skill, honed only for the essential needs of trade, began to transform into a fundamental expectation. The little red schoolhouse, though often rudimentary and under-resourced, became a cornerstone of the American landscape. It was here that the children of farmers and labourers learned that their lives were part of a larger national narrative. They were no longer just the children of a specific valley. They were citizens of a country that was expanding, debating, and industrializing at a breakneck pace. With the ability to read came a profound sense of restlessness. A newspaper was not just a collection of facts, it was a catalogue of possibilities. It told of distant cities, of political shifts in the capital, of technological breakthroughs, and of lives that bore no resemblance to the grueling, agrarian rhythms of their parents. For the young, these pages were intoxicating. They provided a vocabulary for dreams that had previously gone unspoken. The farm, which had been the singular focus of their existence, suddenly felt smaller, tighter, and perhaps for the first time, limiting. This shift created a generational rift that was felt in every household. The elders, who held the memory of the community as their supreme authority, found their narratives competing with the facts found in the printed column. When a young man could quote a government report or read the latest market trends from a city journal, the grandfather's oral history, while still respected, lost its monopoly on truth. The authority of the elders was being challenged by the democratization of information. Yet there was also a collective anxiety that accompanied this newfound literacy. As the world expanded through the reach of the written word, It also felt increasingly anonymous. The village, which had once been a fortress of shared struggle, began to feel like a fragment of a much larger, more complex machine. Families found themselves navigating a dual existence, the traditional, grounded life of their ancestors, and emerging aspirational life fed by the steady stream of information from the outside. They were becoming informed, but in the process they were losing the comfort of the narrow, predictable world they had once known. The quiet darkness of the evening was no longer filled just with the family stories. It was increasingly filled with the silence of individuals reading, reflecting and quietly, individually, beginning to envision a life that existed somewhere else, out there beyond the trees. As the 19th century faded in the rear view of history, the way communities spent their precious, limited leisure time began to undergo a subtle but seismic shift. For generations, entertainment had been an intensely private affair, a story shared by the hearth, a song sung while mending tools, or the quiet, shared silence of family evening. But as the new century took hold, the entertainment began to move outward, migrating from the inner sanctum of the home to the shared, open spaces of the community. The arrival of travelling medicine shows, circus troupes, and local fairgrounds offered a break from the relentless, repeating cycles of labour. These were not merely distractions. They were sensory explosions in a life that had historically been defined by its monochromatic, quiet intensity. For a family that had spent months in the isolate of the forest or the field, the sudden appearance of a bright painted wagon or a tent set up in a town square was a thunderous event. It brought music that wasn't learned from a parent, news that wasn't found in a local sermon, and faces that didn't belong to the kin they had known since birth. These gatherings were the first tremors of a modern mass entertainment culture. They introduced the concept of the spectacle, something meant to be watched, admired, and consumed collectively rather than created and performed by the household itself. There was a palpable shift in the role of the individual. You were no longer just a participant in the social life of your village. You were now an audience. This distinction, while seemingly minor, fundamentally altered the community dynamic. It created a common experience that could be discussed, debated and remembered, a shared memory that existed outside the walls of the domestic unit. However, this transition was marked by a quiet, lingering tension. For the older generation, these spectacles were often viewed with a healthy dose of skepticism. To them, true recreation was rooted in the product work of the household. The idea of paying or travelling just to be entertained felt like a hollow expenditure of energy. They missed the intimate, unstructured nature of the old gatherings, where the quality of the evening was dictated by the depth of the conversation and the strength of the bond between neighbours. Yet for the young, these new avenues were liberating. They offered a glimpse into a world where life was not just about enduring the elements, but about experiencing the unexpected. The fairground, the town square, and the assembly hall became the new frontiers of social life. As people gathered under the flickering, artificial glow of lanterns to watch a show or listen to a travelling orator, the distance between families began to dissolve. They were no longer just clusters of people surviving in isolation. They were a growing, integrate society, beginning to understand the power of collective experience. They were learning for the first time that the world could be a place of wonder, and that sometimes the most important part of life wasn't what you produced, but what you felt when you were standing side by side with your neighbour, watching the unexpected unfold before your very eyes. In the early decades of the 19th century, A distance of 30 miles was a massive daunting barrier, a 2-day expedition fraught with the danger of broken axles, impassable mud, and the deep, silent isolation of the wilderness. People lived their lives within a narrow loop, their world confined to what they could reach on a single team of horses in a day's light. But as the century waned and the new era dawned, the earth itself began to be reshaped. The jagged, winding trails that had been carved by necessity and chance were being smoothed, straightened, and hardened. The expansion of the railway was the final blow to the age of true isolation. When the steam locomotive first roared through a valley, it did more than just move cargo, it shattered the local sense of time and space. Suddenly, a destination that had once taken a week to reach was accessible in a matter of hours. The iron rails were not just tracks. They were thin, metallic threads that stitched the fragmented, secluded settlements of the frontier into single cohesive fabric. For the families living in those remote clearings, the sight of the train, a mechanical dragon-breathing smoke and fire, was a terrifying, beautiful signal that their world was no longer their own. This new ease of movement brought with it a flood of the outside, peddlers with trunks full of manufactured goods, newspapers printed in distant cities, and travellers with strange accents and even stranger ideas began to frequent the local taverns and gathering spots. The predictability of the community, which had been its greatest source of stability, was now constantly under pressure from the influx of new faces and new ways of thinking. It was no longer possible to be entirely forgotten, nor was it possible to remain entirely unaware of the larger tides of the nation. Yet, this transformation was a double-edged sword. While it brought goods, information, and a sense of belonging to a larger whole, it also began to erode the unique local identities that had flourished in the era of total seclusion. When everyone started reading the same newspapers, buying the same factory-made tools, and hearing the same reports from the capital, the distinct regional cultures began to standardize. The vernacular of the valley began to shift, the traditions began to blend, and the slow, rhythmic pace of the local life was increasingly pushed aside by the relentless, scheduled cadence of the railway timetable. People began to view the world through the window of a carriage or a train car, a perspective that was inherently removed and passive. You were no longer walking the land, feeling the soil beneath your boots, and knowing every tree and stream by name. You were traversing it, watching it pass by as a series of vistas. The intimacy of the landscape was being lost to the efficiency of the passage. As the trail widened in roads, and the roads grew into corridors of commerce, the pioneers' descendants found them standing on a path that led everywhere, yet somehow felt less at home. The great silent wilderness that had once been the backdrop of their struggle was now becoming a view to be observed, a resource to be managed, and a barrier to be crossed with increasing speed. As the domestic landscape shifted, the very architecture of the home began to reveal the internal conflict of the era. For the pioneer, a house was a living organism. It was constantly being patched, reinforced, and expanded as the family grew and the seasons took their toll. Every crack in the timber and every worn spot on the floorboards told the story of a specific winter, a specific harvest, or a specific crisis. These were not just flaws, they were the physical evidence of endurance. But as the 20th century settled in, there was an emerging impulse to clean up the past. The weathered, soot-stained logs of the original cabin were often covered over with clapboard siding or layered with fresh, manufactured paint. The goal was no longer just to survive the elements, but to project an image of success and modernity. In the kitchens, the heavy hand, Hewn tables that had been the center of family life for 3 decades were sometimes pushed to the shed, replaced by sleek factory, varnished pieces that didn't show the scars of labor. There was a desire to erase the evidence of the struggle, to leave behind the rough days in favor of a life that felt and looked more polished. For the older generation, this improvement oft felt like a slow, quiet erasure. They walked through rooms that had been modernized and felt a strange, lingering sense of displacement. The hearth, once the source of their heat and the focal point of their evening stories, was now often relegated to a secondary role, replaced by a stove or even a furnace that worked silently in the basement. The house, which had once been the attention of every family member, was becoming a machine for living. More efficient, yes, but all less demanding, less human. This transition forced a quiet reckoning with the concept of heritage. If you replace the tools of your ancestors, if you cover the walls they built with your own hands, do you lose the lessons they taught you? There was a fear that as the material evidence of their past vanished, the stories attached to them would also fade. A wooden cradle, a hand-carved spinning wheel, or a quilt that held the fabric of a dozen different lives, these were the anchors of their identity. When they were discarded for the ease of something new, it felt as though the family was untethering itself from the very foundation that had allowed it to prosper. Yet there was also a profound sense of relief in the ease of the new. The younger generation, tired of the back-breaking, repetitive maintenance of the old ways, embraced the change with open arms. They wanted a home that was lighter, cleaner, and less burdened by the weight of memory. They were not rejecting their parents. They were choosing a different path, a path where progress was not measured by how well you held on to the past, but by how effectively you could build towards the future. And so the houses changed. They became more comfortable, more private, and more detached from the land upon which they sat. The story of the family was no longer written on the walls of the home, but in the aspirations of those who live inside them, individuals who were looking forward. Even as the echoes of their ancestors, labour remained quiet and persistent beneath the fresh layers of paint and the new, unfamiliar furniture. For generations, the path of a child was as predictable as the cycle of the seasons. You learned to plant, you learned to harvest, and you learned to maintain the land that had sustained your family for decades. It was a life of quiet continuity, a baton passed from one set of calloused hands to another. But as the 20th century gained momentum, the soil, once the undisputed centre of gravity for the family's future, began to lose its hold on the next generation. The schools, the newspapers, and the distant, beckoning lights of the cities had whispered a different story, a story of possibility that didn't involve the plough. This shift created a new kind of silence in the farmhouse. It was the silence of parents watching their children study late in the night, not over the mechanics of a tractor or the rotation of crops, but over maps, textbooks, and letters from cousins who had already migrated to the urban centres. For the parents, this was a difficult transition to reconcile. To see their child leave the farm was not just to lose a pair of working hands. It was to witness the dissolution of a lineage they had fought hard to preserve. It felt like a rejection of their own life work, a signal that the hardships they endured were no longer viewed as noble, but as obsolete. However, the younger generation did not see it as a rejection. They saw it as an evolution. They had grown up listening to the stories of their ancestors' struggles, and they respected the grit that had brought them to where they were, but they did not want that same struggle to define their own existence. They were the first to truly believe in the American dream, not as a struggle for survival, but as an opportunity for advancement. They sought roles as clerks, teachers, engineers, and merch professions that offered a life less tethered to the whims of the weather and the cruelty of the harvest. The rift was often bridged by long, complicated letters, the lifeblood of the newly separated family. These letters became the modern equivalent of the fireside stories. They were filled with descriptions of a world that the parents could barely fathom, the noise of the factory, the complexity of the municipal office, and the strange, bustling crowds of the city. The parents read these letters with a mix of pride and profound melancholy. They were proud of their children's success, yet they grieved for the loss of the shared daily rhythm that had bound their family together for so long. The land, once the most precious inheritance, began to feel like a burden to some or a relic to others. As more young people turned their backs on the fields to chase the promise of an education, the countryside itself began to change. Fewer people meant fewer hands to maintain the fences, the barns, and the deep communal bonds of the rural neighbourhood. The zerloi, the branching of the path, was a necessary part of the nation-esque growth, but it left behind a landscape that was quieter, more vacant, and increasingly nostalgic. The family was no longer single unified organisms anchored to one place. It was become a network stretched across the miles, connected by the memories of the soil, but driven by the ambitions of a future that lived, for the most part, elsewhere. For the pioneers, the law was a simple, unspoken agreement. You owned what you cleared, and you were responsible for your own boundaries. Conflicts were resolved at the edge of a fence line or over a cup of coffee at the local general store. But as the 20th century deepened, the shadow of the state began to stretch across the rural horizon. The distant, impersonal mechanisms of government laws regarding property, water rights, and eventually the standardized regulation of agricultural production began to seep in the lives of families who had previously known only the dictates of the seasons. It started with notices pinned to the doors of the local meeting hall, printed in legal jargon that felt like a foreign language to those whose primary vocabulary was tied to the soil. These were directive about crop rotation, health standards for livestock, and the increasingly complex web of taxes that funded the roads, the schools, and the growing national infrastructure. For the farmer, this was a bewildering intrusion. The farm, which had always been a private sanctuary of hard-won independence, was now subject to the oversight of individuals in distant office who had never held a plough and who measured the success of a farm through charts and statistics rather than the health of the earth. This shift brought a quiet, simmering resentment. There was a profound sense of losing one's sovereignty. When a government surveyor appeared to measure a boundary line that had been accepted by neighbours for 30 years, or when a new regulation mandated the disposal of a long-standing method of preservation, it felt like an attack on the family's integrity. The freedom that had driven their ancestors to the frontier was beginning to feel constrained by a dense bureaucrat netting that seemed to tighten with every passing year. Yet this was the price of integration. The very infrastructure that allowed their children to go to school, the railroads that carried their grain to markets, and the legal framework that protected their title to the land, all of it required the sacrifice of that absolute isolated autonomy. The nation was maturing, and with that maturity came a loss of the untamed, unpredictable freedom that had defined the 1800s. The family had to learn to navigate a new landscape, the landscape of politics and law. In the evenings, the conversation around the kitchen table began to change, and It was no longer just about the weather or the health of the livestock. It was about the local representative, the latest ordinance, and the fear that a signature on a document could override a lifetime of labour. They were become participants in a national experiment, citizens of a system that demanded compliance as much as it offered protection. It was a sobering realization that the frontier was no longer a place you could flee to, but a space that was being mapped, measured, and brought in the fold of a regulate society. They were still masters of their land, but they were no longer the sole masters of their destiny. There is a specific kind of melancholy that belongs to those who live through a tectonic shift in the human experience. The generation born in the closing shadows of the 8800s and coming of age in the bright harsh dawn of the 99 duds occupied a liminal space. They were the bridge generation. They had witnessed their parents measure life by the length of a shadow or the ripening of a grain. Yet they were tasked with building a world measured by the tick of a clock, the output of a machine, and the speed of a signal. These individuals walked with one foot firmly planted in the soil of the frontier, and the other tentatively stepping on the concrete of the modern city. In their memories lived the sensory ghosts of a vanished world, the sharp cold bite of a winter morning when the only warmth was the hearth, the smell of fresh-turned earth before the introduction of synthetic fertilizers, the profound, heavy silence of a forest that had not yet been crisscrossed by power lines. They remembered a life where the body was the primary tool of existence, where every drop of sweat had a direct, tangible consequence. But their daily reality was increasingly defined by a new, alien lexicon. They were the ones who had to explain the old ways to their children, only to find that those children, raised in the era of catalogues, schools and rapid transit, viewed these stories as fables from a distant, almost mythic past. They felt like curators of a museum that no one visited. When they spoke of the patience required to weave a garment, or the absolute necessity of reading the weather by the sky, they were met with a polite, vacant confusion. The urgency of the modern world had no room for the slow, meditative pace of the past. This created a quiet, persistent sense of alienation. They felt like strangers in their own lives. They had survived the hard, won independence of the frontier, only to find them navigating a world that demanded conformity, speculation, and speed. They mastered the machines, they adapted to the laws, and they sent their children off to the cities. But at the end of the day, when they sat in the quiet of their homes, they often found themselves reaching back to the old rhythms. They missed the feeling of a life that was whole, a life where the producer, the consumer, and the creator were all one and the same person. Yet there was also a stoic resilience in this generation. They did not despair, they endured. They understood that the world's transformation was as natural and as unstoppable as the changing of the seasons. They accepted their role as the vessels of memory. They knew that while their children might move in the future, the spirit of the past, the endurance, the resourcefulness, and the deep communal reliance was something that would be needed again. They were the silent witnesses, the ones who held the history of the soil in their bones, waiting for the day when the noise of the new world might quiet down and the wisdom of the old world might once again be heard. In the face of relentless transformation, where the tools of labour were being replaced, the distance was shrinking, and the old ways of life were being relegated to memory, the local church stood as a singular, enduring constant. For the families who felt the ground shifting beneath their feet, the sanctuary was more than just a house of worship. It was a fortress of continuity. while the world outside the wooden walls was preoccupied with the roar of the train, the ink of the newspaper, and the pressure of the new economy, the space inside the church remained tethered to a deeper, unchanging rhythm. The Sunday service became the height of the community. It was the one time in the week when the acceleration of life was intentionally halted. Here, the generational rifts that were forming in the fields and the kitchens seemed to narrow. The elders who held the ancient stories sat alongside the young who were dreaming of city careers under the same stained glass. The hymns they sang were a shared vocabulary, a language of resilience that had been handed down through centuries of struggle. When they knelt together, the anxieties of the new century, the taxes, the encroaching regulations, the uncertainty of the future, were momentarily suspended in the face of something that felt eternal. Yet even here, the influence of the modern age was beginning to seep in. The sermons, once focused on the simple agrarian realities of life and death, began to address the challenges of the new world. There were discussions about the morality of machine-driven labour, the potential dangers of urban excess, and the importance of maintaining family virtues in a society that was increasingly individualistic. The church was struggling, much like the families it housed, to define its role in an era where science and industry were rapidly answering questions that had once belonged solely to the realm of faith. For the bridge generation, this place was their most vital sanctuary. They found solace in the repetition of the prayers and the familiarity of the rites. It was a space that didn't demand change. It didn't ask them to be faster, more efficient, or more productive. It simply asked them to be present. In those pews, the whole life they remembered, the life where labour and meaning were inseparable, could still be felt. They saw the church as the final bastion of the communal bond, the last place where a neighbour's trouble was truly their own, and where the collective spirit was not something that could be measured, bought, or sold. But there was a subtle, growing apprehension even in the sanctuary. As more young people departed for the cities, the pews were beginning to look a little thinner. The vibrant energy that once pulsed through the congregation on a Sunday morning was becoming more muted. The faith remained, but the context in which it was practiced was irrevocably changing. They were witnessing a transformation in the communal soul, a slow, quiet migration of the spirit away from the village centre and toward the increasingly decentralized, individual experience of the modern world. They clung to their beliefs, not just as a matter of tradition, but as an act of defiance against a world that seemed determined to leave its history and its humility behind. For the generations that first stepped in the wilderness, the forest was an inexhaustible adversary. It was a vast, dark and different expanse that had to be pushed back to make room for the light of the hearth and the furrows of the plough. But as the 20th century progressed, the scale of that battle changed. The solitary axe wielder, who took only what he needed to build his cabin or heat his home, was replaced by the mechanical saw and the steam-powered mill. The taming of the landscape was no longer a slow, rhythmic labour of necessity. It was an industrial-scale extraction. The shift was almost imperceptible until it wasn't. There were fewer sightings of the deer that had once grazed at the edge of the clearing. The seasonal streams began to run dry with an alarming frequency, and the horizon, once dominated by the solid, majestic wall of ancient trees, began to look jagged and exposed. The pioneers' descendants looked out at the hills, and, for the first time, did not see an endless frontier, but a diminishing resource. The belief that nature was a bottomless well, a divine gift designed solely for human survival, began to crack under the weight of the new reality. This realization brought with it a complex, heavy grief. The older generation, who had spent their youth clearing that very land, found themselves in a contradictory position. They took pride in the farms they had built from the raw wilderness, yet they felt a sharp, hollow ache when they walked through the thinning forest and noticed the silence where there had once been the vibrant, chaotic pulse of life. They were the architects of this change, and they were the first to mourn it. They realized that in their quest to secure a future for their families, they had inadvertently sacrificed a part of the world that could never be reclaimed. There was also growing tension between those who saw the land as a commodity, a factory for lumber, for grain, for profit, and those who began to speak of conservation. It was an alien concept to many. How do you conserve a wilderness that you have spent your entire life trying to subdue? The idea that nature required protection, that it was not merely an obstacle to be overcome, but a delicate system to be respected, was a monumental shift in consciousness. It forced the community to confront the consequences of their own industry. As the sun set over the cleared ridges, casting long stark shadows across the stumps of trees that had stood for centuries, the families felt a quiet unease. They were wealthier, yes. They were more connected, certainly, but they were also more alone. The wilderness that had once provided them with the materials for their homes and the bounty of the hunt was receding, leaving them in a landscape that felt increasingly manicured, predictable and fragile. They were beginning to understand that their dominance over the land came at a price measured not in coin, but in the slow, steady disappearance of the wild, unkempt world that had once been their partner in the difficult, beautiful struggle of life. There was a time when the world was defined by its silences, the deep velvet quiet of a heavy snowfall, the breathless pause of a summer afternoon before a storm, or the rhythmic, singular ticking of a house settling at night. This silence was not an absence, it was a presence. It was the backdrop against which every thought was formed and every emotion was tested. But as the new century accelerated, that fundamental silence began to be crowded out. It was pushed back piece by piece by the relentless, encroaching noise of the industrial age. The hum of the generator, the clatter of the train on the tracks, the distant whistle of the mill, and the incessant mechanical grind of modern labour, these sounds became the new, permanent soundtrack of life. At first it was viewed as the sound of progress, the audible height of a nation that was finally truly alive. But over time, that sound began to seep into the consciousness, filling the spaces that had previously been reserved for reflection. People began to feel an unstated, pervasive anxiety when the noise ceased. They had become so conditioned to the mechanical rhythm that the return of true silence felt unnatural, even eerie. This loss of silence had a profound impact on the human internal landscape. In the era of the pioneer, the quiet had been a crucible for character. It forced a person to confront their own thoughts, their own fears and their own resilience. But in the noisy world of the 20th century, there was always an external sound to retreat into. The radio, the crowd, the bustling streets, these served as a buffer, preventing the individual from ever having to truly sit alone with their own mind. The ability to engage in deep, sustained, unhurried thought began to atrophy. For the older generation, this constant din was a source of fatigue. They missed the clarity that only silence could provide. They found that in the modern world, conversation was increasingly fragmented, broken by the intrusion of whistles, engines, and the frantic pace of the day. There was less room for the slow storytelling that had once defined their communities. The stories had to be shorter, punchier, and more urgent to compete with the sheer volume of the world around them. Yet, there was also tragic irony in this transformation. In their quest to build a world that was connected and vibrant, they had created a life that was constantly on. The quiet, which had once been the ultimate luxury, a space to find oneself, was now something that had to be hunted for, something that was becoming increasingly rare. As families gathered in their homes, they often found them filling the void with trivial talk or the background hum of an appliance, fearful of the introspection that might arise if the room were to fall truly, utterly still. They had conquered the silence of the wilderness, but in doing so, they had sacrificed the silence within them's. The world was louder, faster, and more accessible than ever before, but it had become a place where it was increasingly difficult to hear one's own voice. The pioneers' time was a fluid, organic experience. It was not a resource to be harvested or a commodity to be traded. It was simply the environment in which life unfolded. You worked until the light failed, you rested when the season dictated, and you measured your existence not by the minutes on a dial, but by the growth of a child or the completion of a harvest. There was no such thing as wasting time, there only the rhythm of the day, the week, and the year. But as the 20th century entrenched itself, this fluid notion of time began to freeze into something rigid, measured, and relentlessly demanding. The arrival of the clock, first the grand rhythmic pendulum in the parlour, then the cheaper, omnipresent pocket watch, introduced a new, invisible dictator into the home. For the first time, people were no longer just moving through their day, they were running it. The minute hand became a barrier that separated productivity from failure. The industrial world demanded synchronization, the factory whistle, the train schedule, and the store hours all required a community to move in lockstep. To be late was no longer a personal inconvenience, it was a professional transgression. This shift brought a subtle but profound psychological pressure, the pervasive, low-level anxiety of the missing moment. When you begin to quantify your life in units of time, you inevitably begin to view those units as a limited supply. The concept that time is money, a phrase that would have sounded utterly alien to a homesteader in the Entindundids, became the governing principle of the new era. It colonized the home. The domestic chores that had once been performed with a meditative, unhurried thoroughness were now increasingly subject to the internal pressure to get it done, so that other, more profitable tasks could be started. For the older generation, this was the most jarring adjustment. They felt the loss of that expansive, forgiving horizon of time. They watched their children live in a state of constant, anticipatory motion, always looking at the clock, always calculated how much could be squeezed into the next hour. There was a sense that life had become a series of tasks to be checked off, rather than a continuity to be experienced. The leisure they had once known, the unscripted, spontaneous gatherings became scheduled, losing the very essence of what made them relaxing. The tragic paradox of this transformation was that while they had built a world with more tools, more comfort, and more access, they had less time than ever before. They were masters of a clockwork existence, but they had become servants to its pace. The stillness of the pioneer era, where a person could sit for an hour watching the clouds without, feeling a pang of guilt, was being replaced by a culture that viewed such idleness as a moral failing. As they tightened the springs of their watches and hurried to keep pace with the modern world, they realized that in their effort to maximize every second, they had sacrificed the very thing that made those seconds meaningful, the freedom to simply exist, unhurried and unmeasured, in the quiet expanse of their own lives. The transition was not a clean break. As the new century arrived, it did not arrive as a conqueror that erased the past, but as a rest guest who began to reshape the house from within. For the families who had anchored their lives to the soil, the change was felt as a quiet, gnawing uncertainty. The machines were here, the schedules were written in stone, and the world was undeniably larger, faster, and more demanding. Yet the old ways did not vanish. They simply retreated into the shadows of the new, waiting in the silence between the gears of progress. In the final hours of the season, the elders stood on the porches of their homes, looking out at the ridges that had once defined their entire existence. The trees were thinner, the sounds were more frantic, and the horizon was no longer a promise of solitude, but a gateway to a vast, invisible network of wires and rails. But beneath the fresh paint and the unfamiliar hum of the new age, the height of the land persisted, muffled and distant, like a pulse deep underground. The children were preparing to leave, their bags packed with the blueprints of a future their parents could barely imagine. There was a sense of finality in the air, yet it was countered by an unmistakable, unsettling pulse of possibility. The bridge generation, those who had lived with one foot in the wilderness and the other in the factory, felt a strange, suspended weight. They were the last ones who would truly carry the memory of a world where one's own hands were the only measure of one's worth. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, it cast a long golden light that touched both the weathered barn and the gleaming new train station in the distance. The conflict between the past and the future had not been resolved. It had merely evolved into a new, more complex conversation that had yet to find its language. There were no clear answers waiting in the dark. There was only the knowledge that the path ahead was unwritten, and that the tools of the old world, the grit, the patience, and the capacity for connection would be tested in ways no one could yet predict. The silence that settled over the valley was no longer the deep, heavy stillness of the frontier. It was a restless, expectant silence. It was the pause before a breath that threatened to shake the very foundations of the valley. The families turned back toward their homes, not as people who had finished their journey, but as pioneers standing on. The edge of a different kind of wilderness, a wilderness of steel, abstract commerce, and infinite, overwhelming change. The story of the soil was being folded away, but the story of the family, that fragile, persistent thread, was stretching forward, fraying at the edges, yet reaching, always reaching, into a darkness that held both promise and peril. The morning after the turning point did not bring the clarity the elders had hoped for. Instead, it brought a strange thin light that seemed to expose the fractures in the life they had meticulously built. For those who stayed behind, the farm felt less like a sanctuary and more like an island, surrounded by a rising tide of change they could neither stem nor fully comprehend. The train whistle, once a sound of wonder, now sounded like a persistent reminder of everything that was departing. In the city, the reality of the opportunity the young had chased was proving to be a jarring contrast to the tales told by travelling peddlers. The air was thick with the soot of industry, and the streets were paved with a relentless, hurried rhythm that left no space for the slow contemplation of a sunset. Here, the connections were not built on the shared labour of the harvest, but on the transactional pulse of the marketplace. The children, now young adults, found them in crowded boarding houses, staring at ceilings that didn't know the secrets of their family lineage, wondering if the ambition that drove them here had actually cost them more than they had gained. Back at the farmhouse, the parents moved with a mechanical, almost hollow efficiency. They still performed the chores, still tended the livestock, but the purpose behind the labour felt altered. They were keeping the lights on in a house that was becoming increasingly vacant. The questions remained answered. Was this truly progress, or were they merely the caretakers of a dying tradition? And for the children in the city, the question was just as haunting. If they were to succeed in this new world, what parts of them would they have to leave behind, and would those parts ever truly be gone, or would they remain like ghosts, whispering in the quiet hours of the night? The distance between the valley and the city began to feel not just physical but psychological. Letters were written and sent, but the words struggled to bridge the growing gap in their experiences. The language of the city, filled with talk of wages, hours, and status, clashed with the language of the valley, steeped in seasons, neighbours, and the endurance of the land. They were all still part of the same family, but they were beginning to live in different dimensions of time. As the wind picked up across the empty fields, rattling the loose shingles on the barn, it carried the scent of change, a smell of ozone and wet metal that suggested a storm was brewing, one that would touch both the farmhouse and the tenement alike. Neither side knew what the storm would bring, only that they were now caught in its draught, pulled toward a horizon that was shifting even as they reached for it. The thread was still connected, but it was pulled taut, vibrating with a tension that threatened to snap, leaving them all to wonder what would happen when the tension finally gave way. The arrival of the post was once the high point of the week, a moment of communal excitement where new was shared and savoured. But as the months turned into a year, the letters arriving at the farmhouse began to feel like reports from a distant foreign land. The children wrote of the efficiency of their new lives, of the rapid pace of the streets, and of the peculiar cold logic of their workplaces. They wrote to reassure their parents, but in their efforts to paint a picture of success, they inadvertently painted a picture of someone the parents no longer recognize. At the kitchen table, the parents read these accounts with a deepening sense of unease. They tried to describe the quiet seasonal rhythms of the farm, the way the soil was turning, the health of the remaining. Heard, but these descriptions now felt fragile and small compared to the stories of steel and speed arriving from the city. The letters were become performance pieces. Each side was performing a version of them that they hoped would satisfy the other. The vulnerability, the fear of the unknown, and the exhaustion were carefully edited out, leaving behind a sterile, polite exchange that masked a growing chasm. The silence that followed the reading of a letter was the most telling part of the correspondence. In that silence, the parents would look at the chair where their child once sat, realizing that the person who wrote the letter existed in a world that demanded a version of their child they had never met. They were losing the ability to understand the daily struggles of those they loved most. The city child was learned to define value through coin and clock time, while the farm parent was still anchoring value in the land and the endurance of the body. It was a slow, agonizing realization that they were no longer sharing the same reality. Even when they were together, the atmosphere felt strained, as if they were guests in each other's homes. The children would visit, restless and impatient, their eyes darting to their pocket watches, their minds already back in the frantic rhythm of their jobs. The parents would watch them, feeling an aching nostalgia for the child who used to run through the fields, a child who had been replaced by this focused, weary stranger. The tension was not spoken aloud. It lived in the gaps between the sentences of their letters and in the polite and strained conversations at the dinner table. Both sides felt a quiet, persistent guilt, the children for leaving, the parents for staying, and both sides were terrified that if they were to truly speak their minds, the fragile connection holding them together would finally shatter. They were drifting apart, not because of anger or betrayal, but because the world was pulling them into different orbits. And they all, in their own ways, trying to survive the pull of gravity that was tearing their familiar world asunder. The exodus of the young did not just leave empty chairs at the dinner table, it left a gaping void in the fabric of the community. The local work bees, once vibrant gatherings where neighbours help neighbours harvest, mend fences, or raise barns, began to falter. There were simply not enough able-bodied people left to maintain the complex, interconnected web of labour that had kept the valley thriving for decades. The spirit of collective reliance, which had been the bedrock of their survival, began to fray, as the remaining families were forced to look inward, shielding their own meagre resources. In the place of the familiar, neighbouring faces, a new kind of visitor began to appear. Men arrived from the cities, dressed in suits that looked alien against the dusty backdrop of the valley, representing interests that the locals barely understood: railroad surveyors, land speculators, and agents for large agricultural syndicates. They spoke a language of contracts, deeds, and improved utility. They saw our valley not as a home with generations of memories, but as a map of potential assets waiting to be consolidated. The parents, already weary from the absence of their children, found them fending their land against forces that felt as unstoppable as an oncoming tide. The elders, who had spent their lives working the land in partnership with their neighbours, suddenly found them in a state of isolated competition. To keep their farms afloat, they had to adopt new, often expensive technologies that they did not entirely trust, or sell off parcels of land to pay for the maintenance of the rest. The community was no longer a horizontal network of equals. It was becoming a vertical structure of the desperate, the opportunistic, and the retreating. The local general store, once a hub of gossip and shared wisdom, was now stocked with factory-made goods that the families could barely afford, their own homemade crafts increasingly pushed to the dusty shelves in the back. There was a profound creeping cynicism that began to settle in the valley's atmosphere. Those who stayed felt a mixture of pride for their stubbornness and a bitter resentment toward those who had left, as if the departure of the young had been a betrayal of the land itself. The bond of the neighbourhood, once forged in shared sweat and laughter, was now brittle, marked by guarded conversations and eyes that watched the neighbours' fences more closely than the crops. They were all holding on the past, yet they were all reeling that the past was a house they were increasingly living in alone. As evening fell, the village no longer glowed with the unified, welcome warmth of a dozen hearths. Some houses stood dark and shuttered, the homes of those who had sold out or passed on, their windows like sightless eyes staring out at the changing landscape. The valley was becoming a patchwork of the abandoned and the struggling. The continuity of the community was breaking, and in its place, a new cold pragmatism was taking root, forcing the survivors to choose between the integrity of their heritage and the stark, demanding necessity of survival in a world that had seemingly decided they were obsolete. When the young adults returned for brief seasonal visits, they brought with them more than just suitcases. They brought the disrupt energy of the modern world. They arrived with pamphlets on scientific, farming, candlelit, nanery, and stories of social movements that challenged the established order of the rural church and schoolhouse. To them, the farm was a project to be optimized, a business to be modernized. They spoke of crop yields and market fluctuations with the cold precision of an accountant, while their parents, who still read the soil by the scent of the rain and the colour of the late-day sun, looked on with a mix of pride and profound disorientation. The dinner table became a battlefield of competing realities. The father would describe the wisdom of letting a field lie fallow to recover its strength, and the son would counter with the chemic efficiency of the new synthetic fertilizers he'd read about in the city. The mother would talk of the time-tested labour of canning and preserving by the hearth, and the daughter would speak of the new, mechanized canning plants that promised to do the work of a month in a single afternoon. It wasn't just a difference of opinion. It was a fundamental disagreement about what constituted a good life. The youth viewed the parents' labour as inefficient, while the parents viewed the youth's solutions as soulless. This friction was deeply personal. For the parents, their entire identity was woven in the methods they had perfected over decades. To be told those methods were obsolete felt like a devaluation of their life's work. For the children, they were merely trying to save their parents from the crushing, unending toil they had witnessed growing up. They were blinded by the belief that technology was a panacea, a way to escape the physical toll that had left their parents' hands so permanently scarred and their backs so prematurely bent. They couldn't understand why the parents clung to the very struggle that had defined their hardships. The nights during these visits were filled with a tense, unresolved silence. The young people would pace the floor, restless and unable to fall asleep in the profound quiet of the valley, their minds racing with the pressures of their urban lives. The parents would lie awake in the next room, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of their children's unease, wondering if they had indeed raised a generation that could no longer find peace in the place that had birthed them. They felt like strangers living under the same roof, speaking the same language, but operate in entirely different worlds. The departures were always the most difficult. When the young left, they took with them the vitae that had temporarily breathed life in the home, leaving behind a heavier, more stagnant silence. They left behind books and diagrams that the parents would study with heavy hearts, trying to understand the logic of this new world. It was a cycle of arrival and departure that chipped away at the unity of the family, leaving the parents feeling more isolated than ever, and the children returning to the city with a lingering unresolved guilt that they were moving toward a future their parents could never inhabit. In the quiet rooms of the farmhouse, where the news was once delivered through the slow, deliberative cadence of a visitor's voice or the shared observation of the seasons, a new medium took hold, the newspaper. Arriving in stacks, smelling of fresh ink and industrial grit, these papers brought the outside world into the kitchen. They told stories of distant wars, fluctuating grain prices in cities thousands of miles away, and scientific marvels that defied the logic of the local countryside. For the first time, the family began to see their own lives through the lens of a broader, more frantic world, one that constantly measured their success against standards they had never set for them. The oral tradition, the storytelling that held the family's history, the warnings of the ancestors, and the wisdom of the terrain began to thin. The children, captivated by the printed word, often dismissed the elders' tales as quaint, unverified anecdote. Why listen to a story about a drought from 40 years ago, when you could read about the latest weather forecasting theory published in the city? The authority of experience was being slowly supplanted by the authority of the page. The rich, textured memory of the past was being replaced by the sterilized, objective reporting of the present. This shift created a dangerous intellectual isolation. As the family consumed more of these external narratives, they felt an increasing disconnect from the land they stood upon. They began to interpret the cycles of their farm not through their own observation, but through the generalized advice of agricultural columns. They were no longer reacting to the specific needs of their unique plot of soil. They were trying to mirror the best practices of an idealized, generic landscape. In doing so, they lost the intuitive connection, the knowing that had been passed down like a craft through generations. The elders felt this loss with a sharp, hollow pain. They realized that their knowledge, once vital for the survival of the kin, was being treated as mere entertainment, or worse, as an obstacle to progress. When they attempted to share a lesson on land stewardship, they were met with the polite impatience of those who had already read a better way to do it. The shared vocabulary of the family, the specific names for the slopes, the lore of the creak, the superstitions that had kept them safe, was fading, replaced by the standardized, empty jargon of the newspapers. As the sun set, the family would sit in the dimming light, each member lost in their own copy of the news. The shared silence of the evening now punctuated by the crinkle of paper rather than the warmth of conversation. They were becoming informed about 1,000 things that didn't matter to their daily survival, while becoming increasingly ignorant of the subtle changes in the world right outside their door. They were connected to a world of information, but they were drifting away from the world of experience, unaware that in trading their own voices for the voices on the page, they were losing the only narrative that was truly their own. The house, once an undivided sanctuary of shared life, began to undergo a transformation. As the influence of city living seeped into the valley, the families felt an unspoken pressure to modernize their floor plans. They partitioned the great room, the heart where the hearth had once gathered everyone, in a single warm sphere of existence, into smaller specialized spaces. A formal parlour for receiving guests, a kitchen now designated strict for labour, and bedrooms that offered a newfound, and to some unsettling sense of privacy. The physical boundaries of the house were shifting, and with those walls came a shift in the intimacy of the family. In the old days, to live was to be present with one another. A child falling asleep near the fire heard the rhythmic talk of the parents. The parents heard the breathing of the child. There were no closed doors, only the permeable boundaries of a shared communal breath. But as the architecture changed to mirror the urban ideal of order and separation, that constant, effortless connection was severed. Each person retreated in their own room, their own space, and with that came the birth of a new kind of individual loneliness. The house no longer hummed with the collective vibration of the family. It was a collection of rooms, each holding a different, isolated life. The parlour, newly furnished with stiff, imported chairs and lace that felt too delicate for the dust of the valley, became a stage for pretense. When neighbours visited, they no longer sat on the wooden benches of the kitchen, sharing the remnants of a meal and the raw truth of the day. They were ushered in the parlour, where conversation became formal, guarded, and stripped of the grit that once made it authentic. The home, which had been a place for being, was now a place for showing. The transition felt like a slow performance, a layer of polish applied over a surface that was becoming increasingly brittle. For the elders, this was a source of quiet, constant disorientation. They found themselves walking through hallways that felt like corridors in a strange building, navigating spaces that were designed for functions they didn't require. They missed the chaotic, comforting overlap of lives. They missed the ease of reaching out in the dark and find a presence nearby. They realized that in their pursuit of a better house, they had built a machine for living that prioritized convenience over the messy, essential reality of human connection. As night deepened, the house would fall into silence that was fractured by the closed doors. From behind the walls, one could hear the faint muffled sounds of a life being lived elsewhere, a footstep, a turning page, a cough, but the immediacy was gone. They were under the same roof, but they were living in different corners of an evolving, impersonal structure. The home was no longer a womb for the family spirit. It was becoming a collection of silos, each holding on to its own quiet, private burdens. While the walls between them thickened with every passing day, turning the shared life they had built into a series of parallel, solitary existences. The land, once tended with the patient, watchful eyes of those who understood its temper, began to feel the weight of a new, impersonal urgency. The families who stayed were no longer just farming, they were competing. The newspapers and the visiting agents had instilled a persistent, gnawing fear. If you were not as fast as the man in the next county, if you were not as efficient as the city, driven models dictated, you were failing. The joy of a well-tended furrow or the pride in the specific quality of a harvest was replaced by the anxiety of the output. Time, once a gift of the seasons, had become a currency they were constantly running short of. Every morning the clock, that rigid ticking sentinel on the wall, dictated the rhythm of the day. Breakfast was no longer a time for lingering talk or a shared start to the morning. It was a race against the minute hand. The chores, which once possessed a meditative quality, were now approached with a frantic, superficial speed. There was no time to pause and examine the soil for signs of life or distress. There was only the need to cover as much ground as possible before the light faded. The work was no longer a conversation with the land, it was a demand made upon it. This shift in attitude began to hollow out the spirit of the people. They grew weary in a way that sleep could not touch. When a person works for the sake of the cycle, tending, growing, harvesting, they are replenished by the completion of the task. But when one works for the sake of the clock, the task is never truly finished. It is only paused until the next morning's bell. The labourers in their own fields began to see them as cogs in a larger, invisible machine. Their identity was stripped of its craft, reduced to a measurement of productivity that never seemed high enough to satisfy the demands of the modern market. The physical toll was evident. The movements of the elders, once fluid and adapted to the curves of the earth, became stiff and repetitive. Their hands, which had once practiced the nuanced art of selection and care, were now hardened by the blunt, repetitive motion of keeping up. They looked at their fields and saw not the beautiful, evolving tapestry of the land, but a list of metrics they were failing to meet. The connection they had nurtured for decades, the unspoken understanding of what the land needed, was silenced by the roar of the must and the should of the new economy. As the sun reached its zenith, casting short, unforgiving shadows over the rows of crops, a heavy, pervasive exhaustion settled over the valley. The work continued, but the heart had drifted away. They were building a life that looked prosperous on paper, but in the silence of the afternoon they felt the terrifying emptiness of their own exhaustion. They were the masters of their fields, yet they were slaves to a schedule they had not authored. They were moving faster than ever, but they were no longer sure where they were going, or if the destination they were rushing toward was worth the slow, steady sacrifice of their own peace. the harvest festivals, once the vibrant pulse of the valley, began to lose their meaning. In the past, these gatherings were raw, authentic expressions of relief and gratitude, a communal recognition that they had survived another cycle, that the barn was full and the winter would be endured. They were chaotic, loud, and deeply human. But now, as the valley drifted toward the standards of the modern age, these festivals were being smoothed over, organized in predictable order events that felt more like civic duties than celebrations of life. The traditional music, which used to swell and dip with the unscripted emotions of the players, was being replaced by standardized hymns and popular tunes borrowed from the city's parlors. The food, once a labor of love sourced from every household's garden, was increasingly bought from commercial traders, standardized in flavor and origin. The rituals that had been passed down, specific ways of blessing the first sheaf or the communal sharing of the year's stories, were treated as relics, performed with a polite, detached air, as if the participants were observing their own history from a great distance. The elders watched these performances with a profound, aching sorrow. They remembered a time when the dance was not about rhythm or etiquette, but about the release of a year's worth of labor, when the songs were not just notes on a page, but the living breath of their community. Now, the space between the people felt filled with a polite, invisible barrier. People stood in their Sunday clothes, careful not to wrinkle the fabric, their eyes checking the time. Their conversations focused on the weather or the news, never descend into the depths of what they were true feeling, the fear, the isolation, the creeping sense that the world they had belonged to was slipping through their fingers. This loss of ritual left a vacuum in the spiritual and social life of the valley. Without the unscripted, communal experience that had once bound them together, people began to retreat further into their own private anxieties. The festivals no longer felt like a healing, but a chore. They were a hollow shell of connection in an increasingly disconnected time. The magic of the shared moment, where a group of people could feel as one, had been sacrificed on the altar of order and appearance. As the sun sank low on the night of the harvest dance, leaving the village hall bathed in the flickering, artificial light of gas lamps, the families dispersed early. There was no lingering, no sense of a shared burden being lifted. Each family walked back to their separate partitioned homes, taking with them a lingering, unspoken sadness. They had gathered, they had performed the rituals, but they had not connected. The valley was quieter than it had been in a century, and in that quiet they began to realize that the most precious thing they had lost was not the crops or the land, but the ability to truly, unreservedly be together. The valley had grown strangely quiet, not with the natural silence of a dormant forest, but with a guarded, watchful stillness. The neighbours, who for generation had been the first to show up at a door when there was illness or a broken roof, now moved through their days with a deliberate, averted gaze. Each farm had become a fortress protected by the invisible walls of privacy and a new, pervasive sense of territorial anxiety. They were all struggling to keep their heads above the tide of the changing economy, and in that struggle, they had begun to view each other less as partners in survival and more as rivals for dwindling resources. At the fence line, where men had once spent hours leaning against the wood, discussing the merits of a crop or the health of a herd, the exchanges were now brisk and transactional. The weather is turning, or the market prices are down. These were the new, clipped markers of their interaction. There was no room left for the long, winded, meandering conversations that once bridged the gaps between families. They were exhausted by the effort of their own individual survival, and they had little energy left to spare for the lives of others. The empathy that had once been the valley's strongest currency was being spent on their own frantic efforts to remain relevant. This collective loneliness was a heavy, suffocating weight. Even on Sundays, as they sat in the pews of the village church, there was a palpable distance. They knelt in the same room, but they were no longer praying for the same things. The elders were praying for the restoration of the world they knew, while the younger ones, those few who still remained, were praying for the strength to leave. The shared identity of the congregation had dissolved into a room full of separate, lonely people, each nursing their own quiet failures and their own desperate, unspoken hopes. The children who had moved to the city were still in their thoughts, of course, but the memory of them had become distorted, like a photograph left too long in the sun. They were becoming figures in a dream, an idealized lost generation that the parents talked about with a mixture of pride and profound, unresolved resentment. They wondered if the silence in the neighbouring farmhouse was just like their own, filled with the same shadows and the same ghost-like conversations. They were all living in a village of islands, surrounded by the familiar fields, yet increasingly adrift in a sea of personal, impenetrable melancholy. As the dusk settled over the valley, the individual lights of the farmhouse windows flickered on, one by one. From a distance, they looked like a constellation, a sign of a community still standing. But inside, each home was a hollowed out space where the inhabitant moved with the cautious, hushed steps of people living in a house that no longer belonged to them. They were waiting for a resolution that never came, trapped in the polite, indifferent space between neighbours who had once been brothers. The valley was holding its breath, waiting for something, a storm, a change, or perhaps just a final, crushing realization that would either force them to reach out or pull them completely apart. The attic and the barn, once the repositories of the family's history, began to feel like cemeteries of discarded utility. As the modern world flooded the valley with cheaper factory-made goods, the hand-carved tools, the hand-loomed textiles, and the intricate, sturdy furniture built by grandfathers started to look like clutter. The children, when they returned, would look at these heirlooms with a detached, almost pitying expression. "Why keep this?" they would ask, pointing to a perfectly functional hand-wrought plough or a heavy wool quilt that had kept 3 generations warm. "It's bulky. It belongs in a museum, not a home." For the elders, each object was a vessel of memory, a tactile connection to a life lived with purpose and grit. The nicks in the wood of the workbench were the records of thousands of hours of labour. The worn texture of the quilt was a map of cold winters survived. But as these items were deemed obsolete, the stories attached to them also began to lose their resonance. When the object is gone or ignored, the memory it anchored starts to drift. The elders felt as if their own lives were being systematically devalued, liquidated like assets in a bankruptcy, until all that remained was a collection of useless trinkets. There were rumours of collectors coming from the city, people who looked at these rustic pieces not as tools of a life, but as aesthetic curiosities for their upscale urban apartments. They offered money, sometimes to pay off a tax debt or buy a new, mechanised tractor. The act of selling a piece of the family history became a moral dilemma that tore through the quietude of the house. To sell was to survive, but to sell was also to admit that the past had no value beyond its price. The kitchen tables became sites of bitter arguments, the children insisting on the practical utility of the cash, the parents clutching at the items, as if they were clutching at their own souls. This commodification of their heritage created a new, chilling kind of insecurity. If a item of labour could be reduced to a number on a ledger, then what was the life itself worth? They began to look at their own hands, their own weathered faces, and wonder if they too would one day be appraised by the same cold logic. The world outside was telling them that the only things that mattered were those that could be bought, sold, or measured by profit. The idea of value had been stripped of its human component, leaving them in a house filled with items that were suddenly strangers to them. As the sun caught the edge of an old iron tool, casting a shadow that seemed too long for its size, the silence in the room was heavy with the presence of things about to be forgotten. They had spent their lives building a world of substance, only to find them living in a world of surfaces. The objects were still there, gathering dust in the corners, but they no longer spoke. They were silent witness to a house that was slowly emptying itself, not of people, but of meaning. They were waiting to be sold, to be discarded, or simply to rot, and in that waiting, the family felt the final, creeping realization that the foundation they'd built upon was being pulled out from under them, one piece, one memory, at a time. The silence that had settled over the farmhouse was increasingly punctuated by a new gnawing anxiety, the observation of the children's own internal struggles. When the young came back for their brief visits, they seemed haunted by a restlessness that the parents could not soothe. They were faster, yes, and sharper, but they were also frayed, prone to long bouts of insomnia, sudden fits of irritability, and a profound inability to find comfort in the very landscape that had once nurtured their ancestors. The parents watched them and wondered, was this simply the price of progress, or were they witnessing the slow, irreversible fragmentation of their own lineage? They looked for trace of thems in their children's eyes, the stubborn resilience, the quiet patience of the soil tenders, but they found instead a reflection of the city's frantic pace. The children seemed to have developed a modern nervous system, one that was always reaching for a phantom stimulus, always bracing for an impact that never came. They had lost the ability to sit with their own thoughts, viewing the quiet of the valley not as a balm, but as an encroaching void that forced them to confront their own emptiness. It was as if they had inherited the endurance of their forefathers, but lacked the context to apply it to anything meaningful. A terrible whispered fear began to take root in the parents' hearts. Had they failed to pass on the one thing that truly mattered? They had given their children land, they had given them tools, they had even given them the education to survive in the new world, but they had failed to give them the internal compass, the anchor, that had kept the family steady through generations. The children were successful in the eyes of the city, yet they were spiritually malnourished. They were strong enough to work, but they were too fragile to exist without constant movement. The children, for their part, felt the weight of their parents' scrutiny and mistook it for judgment. They felt that their parents expected them to carry the heavy, dusty mantles of the past, mantles that no longer fit in the industrial era. They felt a deep ancestral exhaustion, a fatigue that seemed to precede their own births, as if they had been born into a debt of tradition they could never hope to pay off. They were struggling not just to succeed in their careers, but to define who they were, suspended between the ancient, slow rhythms of the farm and the relentless, electric demand of the future. As the wind gusted against the house, rattling the window panes with a persistent, mournful sound, the family sat in the living room, each wrapped in their own separate, impenetrable thoughts. The parents saw the children as broken mirrors reflecting a lost identity The children saw the parents as relics of a world that had ceased to exist. They were bound by blood and history, yet they were growing into people who would not have chosen each other if they had met in the street. The legacy of the family, once a source of strength, was becoming a source of quiet, enduring trauma. A genetic memory of struggle that they were all, in their own ways, trying to survive in the cold, unyielding light of the new century. The most subtle yet most profound invasion was not that of the machines or the speculators, but of the clock itself. In the older days, the time was fluid, dictated by the sun's arc, the behaviour of the livestock, and the ripening of the corn. A day was long as the work required, and a season was a broad breathing span of existence. But now the farmhouse walls were adorned with ticking sentinels, metronomic, unyielding and precise. The household began to move in sync with the mechanical pulse, transforming their lives into a series of timed intervals. There was a proper time to eat, a proper time to rest, and a proper time to work, and any deviation was met with a sense of failure. This shift in temporal consciousness created a pervasive, underlying stress. They no longer experienced the day as a wholeness. They chopped it into segments, always looking ahead to the next obligation. The elders found them checking the wall clock even when they were sitting on the porch, as if they had forgotten how to exist in the present moment, without the validation of the hour. They began to feel that their natural intuition, the internal clock that had guided them through weather shifts and animal cycles, was something inaccurate, something they needed to suppress in favour of the standardized industrial time. The younger generation during their visits carried this obsession even further. They arrived with pocket watches and schedules, their entire existence mapped out in minutes and seconds. To them, time was a resource to be spent, an asset to be managed, and the slow, meandering conversations of their parents felt like a theft of their productivity. The gap between them widened not just in thought, but in the very rhythm of their heartbeats. The parents were trying to live in a cycle. The children were trying to live in a line. And as they walked through the fields, the contrast was sharp. The parent the slow, enduring pulse of the earth, while the children felt the frantic, ticking anxiety of the train schedule. This mechanical regulation of life had a strange, alienating effect on their relationship with the environment. They stopped observing the subtle changes in the valley, the way the light shifted in the autumn, the exact day the first frost would arrive, because these things could not be measured by the clock. They became preoccupied with the duration of their effort, rather than the quality of their connection to the land. The farm became a laboratory of efficiency, a place where they were constantly trying to beat the clock, oblivious to the fact that, in trying to master time, they were losing the ability to simply live within it. As the sun sank behind the ridges, marking the end of another productive day, the family would sit in the dimming parlour, the rhythmic ticking of the clocks amplified by the heavy silence. They were all tired, not with the deep, replenishing fatigue of a body that had done good work, but with the hollow, brittle exhaustion of those who had spent the day fighting the clock. They were living in a reality that was no longer their own, a rhythm imposed from the outside that they couldn't escape. They had become inhabitants of a world that was perpetually rushing toward a future that felt increasingly empty, leaving them to wonder, in the dead of the night, if they had forgotten how to count the hours that actually mattered. The final season of their shared history did not arrive with a catastrophe, but with a quiet, inevitable settling of dust. The children did not return to the farmhouse. They had built their lives into the architecture of the city. their identities now inseparable from the frantic electric rhythm they had once feared. The parents, now keepers a silent, echoing legacy, finally let the last of the clocks run down. They stopped tracking the hours by the mechanical pulse and returned, in their own twilight, to the ancient, wordless dialogue with the soil. They were no longer trying to bridge the gap. They had simply come to accept that they lived on different shores of the same vast, shifting century. There was no grand reconciliation, nor was there a bitter rupture. There was only the slow, natural erosion of the ties that had once been forged in the crucible of survival. Letters still travelled between the valley and the city, their contents become increasingly sparse, polite, and distant formal tokens of an affection that had survived the erosion of common ground. The children would sometimes look out from their high-rise windows at the distant horizon, wondering if the old barn was still standing, while the parents, sitting on the porch as the sun dipped below the ridges, would occasionally whisper the names of their children into the wind, letting the sound be carried away by the same breeze that stirred the young wheat. The house itself, once a vibrant crowd home, began to reclaim its place within the landscape. The partitions that had divided their intimacy began to sag, the wood settling in the earth, the garden encroaching on the once tended flower beds. It was not a ruin, it was a return. The land, indifferent to the ambitions of men and the ticking of machines, continued its long, cyclical dance of growth and decay. The bridge generation had served its purpose. They were the ones who had endured the tearing, who had felt the stretch of the gap, and who had carried the memory of the transition in their own weary bones. As the years blurred, the valley was slow reshaped, its history becoming a layer in the strata of time. As hidden and silent as the ancient prairie that had existed long before the first plough broke the sod. There were no longer farm families or city pioneers. There was only the ongoing, restless flow of life, ever-changing, ever-reaching. The legacy was not in the land they held, nor the objects they left behind, but in the enduring, fragile question that lingered. In the minds of those who followed, how much of the past can one carry into the future before the weight becomes unbearable? There was no answer, only the sound of the wind moving through the tall grass, a sound that was at once a lament and a promise. The story had not ended. It had simply dissolved in the air, into the soil, into the very cells of those who had lived it. They had been part of a great turning, and as the stars aligned over the valley, watching the lights of the distant city blink like a constellation of their own making, the night held them all in a profound, uncaring, and beautiful stillness. The gap remained, a permanent feature of their landscape, but it was no longer a wound. It was simply the space where the future had been born, and in that space there was finally room for everything to be. Sleepy History with Kevin is created for relaxation, entertainment, and sleep purposes. The stories shared on this channel are inspired by historical events, daily life, and real periods in history, but they may be simplified, adapted, or narrated in a calming way to enhance the listening experience. This content is not intended to be a precise academic or educational source. While we aim to stay generally accurate, some details may be altered for storytelling flow and relaxation. Please do not rely on this channel as a primary source for historical research or study. By listening, you acknowledge that this content is designed to help you unwind, relax, and fall asleep. Thank you for your understanding and support.